Let's start again. All right, welcome to the last Marx 1313. It's an absolute thrill to be back with Étienne Balibar 8 months later, after a full and enriching year of brilliant interventions by remarkable guests. And of course, it all started here in this room with Étienne. Now, the ambition for this final session is to close by reading and discussing some of the last written works of Karl Marx. And actually, I also want to welcome the University of Chicago team to join the Columbia team here. It's great to have Anton Ford, professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago, and the students from the University of Chicago here as well. Okay, so I was saying, the ambition for this final session, then, is to close by reading and discussing some of the last written works of Karl Marx. And I think what I'd like to do is I'm going to open it up with 3 points and turn it over to Étienne Balibar shortly after that. So I want to start with trois repères, 3 points of reference. The first, and these are going to be slightly provocative just to get the conversation going. The first is that, on my view, the late Marx is not inconsistent with the mature economic Marx of Capital. And that they're fundamentally they're imbricated, the political and the economic work. And that what is so utterly fascinating about these late works is the way in which they actually give us, they present Marx's political thinking, right, after he has fully articulated his mature economic thought. Now, that's not true of other great texts that we studied all year and that are equally important, like the Communist Manifesto in 48, or the 18th Brumaire in 52, or much earlier, the articles in the Rhenish Gazette, right? It's those weren't yet formulated as in terms of their political dimension with the full economic mature thought present. So what we've got is something remarkable in these particular texts, the ones that follow the publication of Capital, which is the way in which they grow out of a capital. And in a certain way, we could think of them as being the political volume, okay, of Capital. Now, there are, of course, many thinkers, particularly the thinkers of the late Marx, who tend to feel as if there's been shifts, changes in some of the economic views. And we saw that especially when we were discussing with Kohei Saito. Brilliant work. But the idea is that something shifted. He became more ecologically conscious. He became conscious of the Eurocentrism of the work and focused more on the global South, focused more on Russia, on India, etc. But also became very sensitive to to ecology. And some people suggest, and I think it's important and really insightful that he evolves towards something that could be thought of as eco-socialism, possibly. I mean, Kohei Saito actually would argue degrowth communism, right? But the idea there, of course, is that there's a moving away, in a way, a revisiting, a reconsideration, in a sense, which might explain, some of them suggest, why he never wrote volumes 2 and 3, right? Because he was reconsidering, looking at new material, going in different directions. And of course, we have the ethnological notebooks and everything. The other thinkers like Tony Negri, in Marx Beyond Marx, and we discussed this with Michael Hart and with Sandro Mezzadra at Marx 9:13, suggests that the political is really in the Grundrisse. That's where you find the political Marx in the Grundrisse. And so therefore, if you want to go to the political, you have to go back to that text, and that somehow it wasn't included in Capital, right? That it was exercised from volume 1 to their chagrin. But that would be in a way where you might go back. And what I want to suggest instead is that actually, no, these later works that we're going to be looking at today, so the critique of the Gotha program, his conspectus on Bakunin's book, Statism and Anarchy, and the letter and the drafts to Vera Zasulich in 1881, that actually those are consistent. They work together. They aren't inconsistent, and they are actually kind of the political implications of Capital Volume 1. They have a clear, coherent message, which is that what is called for is revolutionizing the conditions of production. Okay? And that in a way, that is the implication of the mature economic work. And of course, it takes different shapes in different historical contexts, in different geographical contexts, in different conjunctures, in different political contexts. So that's going to translate differently for the case of Russia in 1880 than it is for the case of Germany in 1875. Now, so that's the first provocative point I'd like to make, that actually what I see here are consistencies, strains, implications. And I think that you really feel it in these texts when Marx, for instance, he follows up his letter where he's sharing the Gotha program, right? How does it end? Well, it ends with 1875, 150 years ago. We're celebrating the 150th year of, how does it end? Well, it ends with, did you receive the installments of Capital, the French translation of Capital? Did you get all the 6 and give me the address, give me the email address of Bernard Benke, his other another rival in these contexts, because I want to send my installments to him as well, right? Bernhard Becker's address, where I have to send him the final installments as well. I mean, this is, in a way, he's sharing the oeuvre that is at the source of the scientific insights, which he specifically refers to in the Gotha program, that are Capital. Okay, so that's the first point. Now, the second point is that this actually says something interesting about...
The reason why I call this a provocation,
yes,
is that of course, that I have a totally different position on all this.
Yes, that's...
So I'll have to defend myself. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. All right. The second, I'll get to you in just a second.
No,
Etienne.
take it.
All right.
No worries.
So the second thing is that this actually shows, I would say, an interesting relationship between praxis and theory, which of course has always been at the heart of these debates, is the relationship between praxis and theory. I mean, that is the question of critical theory, probably. And there's a way in which here, actually, I think that the relationship is one that goes from theory to praxis. The relationship is, obviously it's complex, but for Marx, I really feel as if he needed to nail down the mature economic thought in order to then be able to make the interventions that he's making here. And so that there is a sense in which there is a direction in the relationship between between theory and praxis. And obviously, that relationship, there are multiple ways in which that relationship can work. And we often hesitate to suggest that praxis would flow from theory. You know, we think that's kind of flat-footed, right? And we want to give theory a praxis a greater role, often in stimulating theory itself. But I feel that there's sufficient indications in here and in this work that the primacy was on the economic theory, and that the political implications, which have to be, of course, historical, they have to be contextual, they have to be conjunctural, it has to be right in Germany in 1875, whatever, but that they flow from in some way. So that would be the second provocation. The third, of course, is that Etienne, of course, now you have taken a somewhat different position, at least in the sense of arguing that the relationship between these texts, particularly between the Gotha Program and the conspectus on Bakunin's book, because of the way that it's structured, in a way, creates an aporia. And so I shared that, and so some of us had a chance to read some of that older work.
Yes, but then I realized that I had repeated more or less the same idea in a short passage of the small book that you already gave, I believe, as a reference, called The Philosophy of Marx.
Okay.
It's also there.
Okay,
the idea
good.
is also there.
Okay, great.
For what it is worth.
Okay. So, I mean, I did want to end on that note. Maybe that's not a provocation. That's more of an introduction on the third point, because I do want to hear you on that specific argument. So, well, actually, no, I will turn it into a provocation, Etienne, just to give a third point. So, I think it's entirely right that the way in which the poles are set up here, with on the one hand an anarchist and on the other hand someone who is viewed as statist, right, creates difficulty in the discourse, in the language that Marx can use, because he's being pulled and pushed in two very different directions, right? When he's commenting on the Gotha Program and when he's commenting on Bakunin, he's being pulled and pushed in two different directions. And so it makes it difficult for him language-wise, I think, and that creates certain aporias. But I don't think substantively, I think he's got the same position in both, which is this idea that we have to find ways that he is trying to find ways for the working class, for what he calls the proletariat, to organize itself administratively, to kind of, what are the administrative ways in which it must organize itself to govern itself through forms of party organization, trade unionization, worker cooperatives, right? What are those forms of organization that are necessary in order to create the revolutionary transformation of the conditions of production? And so even though he is being pulled, and even though he has a hard time with the word state, and in the introduction, there's this there's a new translation of the Gotha Program by Kevin Anderson, which is new in the sense that they have extracted the word state from a particular passage. I describe it in the introduction. Extracted the word state from a particular passage. I'll pull it up for you in a second, because the word in German was Staatswesen, and it was usually translated as state. And so the new translation, the new publication just came out, 2022 PM Press, Kevin Anderson. They replace state with body politic in that place, which I know I said I prefer something like the nature of the state, or the essence, or the being of the state, or something. But basically, they're trying to trying to extract the state from the words, to suggest that he wasn't really talking about the state being present in a communist society, but what would be the essence of the state? What would be state-like? What would be the nature of the state? And of course, that would be these passages where, I mean, maybe I'm saying, I think this is what they would say as well. That would be the passages where Marx is talking about, like, the executive committee of a trade union, right? Or the managing members of a worker cooperative, right? Those are the ways in which this would be organized. Those would be the functions, the state functions, etc. But so the third provocation, I think, maybe just to get you going, Etienne, although that's not necessary, yeah, is yeah, I mean, is the aporia in a way linguistic, discursive, but or is there a resolution that I can somehow identify? Okay, all right. So those are the three provocations. I have to say that there's no one better to finish this Marx 1313 than with you, Etienne.
Okay.
You have been our guiding star from the beginning, our kind of our Sherpa,
Just a friend.
our master,
Just
a friend. Well, you know,
bullshit.
well, you know, I love the way you always refer to Althusser as your maître. So whatever that relationship would be, I think we feel that way, and we thank you for.
It's a perilous seat, as the legend has it. Yes.
Yeah. So with those provocations, Etienne, let me turn it to you, and thank you so much for kicking us off.
You give me 5 minutes.
5 minutes. 5 minutes and 3 hours. Okay. Yes.
Thank you. You see the kind of very nice intellectual and professional and friendly relationship we've had for years, and that continues. Bernard calls it provocations. I think that this is just the kind of provocations we need to try and go to the heart of not our disagreements, but our common interrogations.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll ask for your understanding. I'm not in my best shape, especially to speak. I don't know how that happened, but between yesterday and today, I caught some sort of cold or whatever, so I have sore throat, and I'm not okay. Forget about that. It is not the case that I have a totally different position on each and every of the three issues that you raised. But yes, certainly I have a slightly different approach. Perhaps it has to do with something that you mentioned at the end, and which I take very seriously, namely the question of language. I'm not saying that you are trying to put linguistic or terminological or discursive issues on one side, and substantive or questions of doctrine and content in a completely separated place. But yes, probably, and I don't know if that's something good or detrimental. I have increasingly become convinced that you can never separate these two aspects. Mm-hmm. And so I have a tendency to try and retrieve and describe the substantial issues through discussions of words and more, not only words, but sentences written by Marx, and not only not just the sentences as you can find them as when they are just printed on a book, but behind the printed or together with the printed material, I can't help trying to figure out, to imagine, and to reconstruct, with, of course, uncertainties and a danger to go into the wrong direction, the very process of writing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And now, of course, in a sense, this is too easy, or perhaps the opposite. It's we are placed in a particularly embarrassing or difficult situation when the material that we take into account, that is our basis for discussion, directly exhibits some such, I would say, blatant symptoms of hesitation, contradiction sometimes, and in any case, a process of writing which is anything but completely assured of its conclusion. So when you say I read in these texts Gotha, conspect on Bakunin, or letter to Vera Zasulich, a direct continuation and application of the most central ideas that Marx already systematically presented or exposed in his previous works. Yes, of course, I don't deny that. They certainly, but on the other hand, which texts exactly are you talking about? So I'll return to that, but quickly to let you know. The choice we made together, of course. But initially, Bernard said to me, okay, would you agree to do the final session? I said, yes, if you ask me, I'd be happy to do it. And then, of course, comes the, it's not an ambiguity, but it's an interesting kind of complexity. You're expected in the last session of a seminar more or less to sum up, to round up what has been presented in the previous sessions. So show how consistent, how enduring, how solid Marx's legacy is for our thought and our present. And of course, I have these feelings. Sometimes I try to move to other authors, places of interest. I decide to draw inspiration from writers or thinkers who, in a sense, are completely opposed to Marx, not necessary to give names. But whenever I return to Marx, and especially to Capital, of course, but not only, my admiration and comes back, and yes, I see there a body of theory which which I am not going to dismiss or to try and deconstruct so that nothing is left. In the very there are many symptoms in the text. In the final version, I'll come back to return to the drafts of the so-called reply to Zasulich that you may have a look at. You find this, I don't know what it is in Russian. That would be interesting. You know that Marx, in his last years, I envy him. I wish I could have done that myself. He learned Russian and I don't know if he could speak, but he could write. And in any case, he could. So he read Bakunin in Russian. And he explains in his letter, or the draft letter to Zasulich, that he has learned Russian in order to be able to read a huge amount of economic and statistical material and so on and so forth. Okay, so what is...
But he is writing in French.
You think he's writing in French?
Yeah, to Zasulich.
Good. So I'd have to return. But in English, and I'm sure it's at the end of the first paragraph, he writes the following: "Dear citizen, a nervous complaint," I'll come back to that, which has periodically affected me, etc., prevented me from writing what I... Still, I hope that a few lines will suffice to leave you in no doubt. Everything pulls into different directions, leaves you in no doubt about the way in which my so-called theory has been misunderstood. So-called theory. So as if taking a distance. So is that a distance with respect to the interpretation offered to you? Call it my theory, but it's not my theory. Or is it something a little deeper? You call it, or you might believe this is a theory. No, it's not a theory. But it's something very, very, very... Still, returning to my idea. So we decided that we would pick up among the... if you look at the last volumes in Marx's complete writings, there are lots of small texts on various subjects. But we chose the Gotha Program for the reason that you indicated at the end, because it's a key central text which addresses the question of the political force, the political organization, which is supposed to bring about the revolutionary transformation on behalf of the proletariat, or organizing the proletariat. So that's clearly central. If I have time, I return to what made that text the absolute reference that it is. And then the letter to Vera Zasulich, this had to do with some of the recent discussions that you alluded to. So you mentioned Saito. I admire Kohei Saito's... I'm not convinced by each and every of his arguments, but that this is a very profound way of reading and continuing Marx, of course. But at the same time, and I'm sure that some speakers, I didn't find the time to listen to the recordings, all of them, but I'm sure that some speakers already addressed this question that you mentioned a little with some irony, whether Marx in his last year had suddenly realized, let's put it like that, that he should stop to be Eurocentric and become a post-colonial thinker in advance. I mean, look east and beyond the et cetera. So, and whenever this question was raised, and this question involves, as you know, by the text itself, a reconsideration, like it or not, of the form in which Marx himself very explicitly had presented the idea that there is something like a line of evolution of social formations or modes of production that makes it possible to understand how capitalism, in a sense, represents the ultimate or the point of arrival of a long story of class struggles and exploitations, and simultaneously, dialectically, if you prefer, lays the basis for a jump, so to speak, as he once wrote in very philosophical, almost mystical terms, from the realm of necessity into the realm of liberty, that is, from the world of exploitation and into the world of association and free and freedom. So that line of evolution, the idea of that line of evolution is there in Marx very explicitly. How could you deny that? Huh? There's one, that's why he's so embarrassed when he needs to write the replica to the populists, because he takes them very seriously. There's no doubt about that. He even, in a sense, repeats, addressing them, the famous quip, you know, that we know in his discussions with the French. Si quelque chose est sûr, c'est que je ne suis pas marxiste. If there is something certain, I'm not a Marxist. Marx. And so in the case of the discussion with the Russians, Comrade Vera Zasulich, she's an extraordinary person. She writes to him, our local Marxists derive from your theory. The idea that the so-called peasant commune, the mir, or the other names for that, is an archaic form, an archaic mode of production and form of society that is bound to collapse under the effects and assaults of the capitalist forces and the capitalist mode of production. And in a sense, this is what must happen. This is what needs to happen, because your theory shows that it's only on the basis of developed capitalism that a communist society can emerge. So it will not keep or find its infrastructure, its basis in these archaic peasant forms. It will find them in the modern industrial division of labor and organization of capitalist industry, and Marx did write that. He published the volume 1 of Capital, which in a sense is a complete work, with a Latin, with a preface, ending with a Latin quotation. He knew his classical authors by heart, so that's from Horatius, probably, or said, addressing the German readers. You might believe that this is not, this doesn't concern you, because I'm talking about the industrial society that is now full-fledged and completely exists in Britain. And you have a very different history and social structure. Make no mistake, he writes, de te fabula narratur. In this story, it is a question of you. It's your story as well. And there's absolutely nothing. I take the bet. I mean, the gambit. If you read that, there's no proviso such as the one that he introduces later, that he tries to introduce in the draft. No. I was not talking about Russia. I was not. I was talking only about the Western states and societies. So you should have understood that in your case, things go in the opposite direction. So it's a little more complicated in details, but this is a fact in a sense. So this explains partly why this letter, or this draft letter, has become such an insistent reference in recent debates. Not so recent, in fact. It began when I was still younger. But a constant reference for discussions which, at the very minimum, I mean, try to address the crucial, politically and historically and scientifically crucial question of the evolutionist dimension in Marx's thought. And sorry to quote myself, but I may have it somewhere here in the little book called The Philosophy of Marx. I devoted a small chapter to try and justify this idea. I said there are different versions of Marx's picture, Marx's view of the so-called course or trajectory of history, or the historical tendency from class societies to classless society, and the change is unmistakable, because if you take the preface to the contribution of the critique of the political economy in 1859, he explicitly says the course of that history passes universally for every society that, so at a very abstract level, of course, universally, from slavery to the so-called Asiatic mode of production that later Stalin forced the Marxists to erase from the text, to the feudal master, lord and tenant relationship, to etc., to the capitalist mode of production, which is the last in the series. After which there's only one possibility: a communist revolution. And it's not only implicitly linear, it's explicitly linear at a very abstract level. I agree. And so I did my best after others to explain that if you take seriously the draft of the letter to Vera Zasulich, it says the opposite. It says the opposite. It's not linear. It depends on, there are bifurcations, there are short circuits, there are different paths towards the same goal, more or less. I return to that, namely communism. And in particular, so perhaps he's flattering them, of you Russians, you are lucky people, because you have kept something from an archaic past which perhaps can be used as a foundation to avoid, he writes, avoid the suffering of capitalism, and jump directly with some conditions. I'll return to that, etc. So I am of the, but hope you didn't lose me completely. So we had chosen these two texts. And then I asked your permission to add the Bakunin conspectus. And the point to which I want to arrive, returning to this question of language and so on, and writing, is that this is not capital. This is not a book completely written and proposed to a publisher, and that Marx would ask people to read. These are unpublished texts. And in one case, so in the case of the Gotha program, it's a very strange thing. Why did the Gotha program become a kind of central, the critique of the Gotha program, a kind of central reference in, I would say, orthodox Marxism, with some varieties, differences that some people of my generation were, in a sense, educated in, because it was canonized, first by the Second International, and above all by Lenin, Stalin after him, and their readers and continuators and disciples. Initially, the Gotha program was the program for the Social Democratic, the German Socialist Democratic Party at its Congress in 1875, and a very interesting date, and a turning point in many respects. And as usual, of course, the Congress was the place of a tension, a conflict to some extent, or a struggle of influence between social democratic leaders who were close friends of Marx himself personally, and therefore presented themselves as his more or less spokespersons. And the party unified different socialist tendencies in Germany. It unified the Marxists with the disciples of Ferdinand Lassalle, the other great leader, etc. And therefore, and Marx was furious because he thought that in the final version of their common program, his friends, his disciples, so the ones to whom the letters are addressed, Liebknecht, Braque, and so on, had made huge concessions to the language and the conceptions of the other side, that is Lassalle. We're not going to enter it. It's long and it's an interesting story, but another, of course, 1848er. So he was dead at the time, but he wrote these Randglossen, these marginal notes, furious notes on the program, on the draft program, saying, you cannot write this, it's unacceptable, it's totally wrong, it goes into the wrong direction. We'll come to that, I hope, and sent it to his friends, to his comrades. And it ends with this formula that my master, as you call him, was eager to repeat. Dixi et salvavi animam meam. It's a church Latin. It's I spoke and I saved my soul. And because I said what I had to say. But now put this into the drawer. Because during the Congress, the relationship of forces has changed. You, my friends, are in fact in control of the party. So I'm not going to make things too complicated for you. And so okay. So I will return to the anarchist side. So this text was never intended to become a kind of theoretical masterpiece and foundation. So it's a long story, etc. 10 years later or 15 years later, Marx was dead, another Congress was taking place, and Engels, the continuator and friend, etc., found himself in a similar situation. So he returned to Marx's notes, and he discovered that he could make use of them. So he brought them back. He published them, and there are letters in which he said, "You see, I will publish this in the party newspaper, and you'll see some people will be very happy, but others will be furious, but because it reveals the depth of their etc." So the text became public, but it became public in circumstances which didn't make it a work in the proper sense. It made it a weapon in a match, in a boxing, etc. And it's only retrospectively, and so I stopped there, of course, through the use that was made by, especially by Lenin, and that became official, of course, by Lenin. And one of the reasons why Lenin, okay, we might come to that in the discussion. One of the reasons was the catchword, dictatorship of the proletariat, is there in one of the passages. And it's one of the very few passages in Marx's works where this expression is used. So for Lenin, it was extremely precious. And but he transformed, but through Stalin, blah, blah, it became a sacred reference. Sacred, which might explain to you why I'm so eager to deconstruct the etc. I know I'm already abusing etc., but let me tell you an anecdote. Many years ago, I was a professor at the University of Nanterre, at the other end of the Paris region. And one day, we were informed by our chair in the department that a delegation of Chinese professors of Marxism wanted to meet with French Marxists and discuss it. So that was in the 90s, and the late 90s. Keep that in mind. So they had asked, I don't know, the Ministère des Affaires étrangères, where can we find Marxists in France? And the ministry had said, go to Nanterre, that's where they are all. So they went to Nanterre and asked the same question to the presidency, and presidency said, go to the philosophy department, that's where they are. And effectively in the philosophy department, there were 3 Marxists, myself, Tony Andreani, and Jacques Bidet, the 3 of us on completely different positions regarding Marxism, but all officially Marxists. So we find ourselves in a room, not very luxurious, with the 3 men from Beijing, black suits and ties, very, very serious, and kind of diplomatic encounter. And at some moment, I was a little tired with formal considerations. So China, of course, had changed course since the years of Mao. So I asked him, could you perhaps explain to us which stage in the transition from capitalism to communism you have now reached in Chinese politics? And so the chief of the delegation, it was very hierarchical, said to me, we are in the intermediate middle stage between socialism and communism, as explained by Marx in the critique of the Gotha Program. I said to him, sorry, professor, I'm very sorry to contradict you, but the critique of the Gotha Program never uses the word socialism, and especially not the idea of the socialist phase. It speaks only of the first phase of communism and the second. And he said to me, what? I wrote an entire book on this, I said. But I could tell you hundreds of similar stories. At some point in the Soviet Union or in China, if you mistook, if you indicated the wrong place in the transition, etc., you could go pure and simply to a concentration camp. Because it had political implications, of course. So this has been canonized. And forgive me, and I find it a fascinating and very important text. But I would not say that this is a stable final and uncontroversial text. But the situation is, I know I'm too long, but the situation is even worse for the letter to Vera Zasulich, because what you have in your hands, and Bernard gave us the necessary references, so you could download the text, are two things. You have three things. You have the letter that Vera Zasulich sent to Marx, one page, in which she asks him very politely and with great dignity and not in a servile manner, but with admiration, if he would perhaps be able to take sides. I mean, to decide which interpretation, which reading of Capital is good. The one that is proposed by the Marxists and the one that is proposed by the populists. And so, and you have Marx's final answer, which begins with what I was reading. A nervous complaint which has periodically affected me for the last 10 years has prevented me from answering sooner your letter of 16 February. I regret that I am unable to give you a concise account for publication of the question which you did me the honor of raising. Some months ago, I already promised a text on the same subject, etc., etc. But etc. And then you have this, it's not even one page. But of course, as for many other texts, important texts in Marx's legacy, particularly the address, that's the one that comes always to my mind, known on the Paris Commune, known as the Civil War in France. We also have the drafts, but in this case, the drafts are very. The first is long, and the other two are shorter, and they repeat what's in the first. So I'm not saying it's not interesting. It is. It is full of interest here, but it's pathetic in a sense, because you see almost physically a guy who's trying to write something and cannot do it, Now, why is he unable to do it? And if we had time, that would take us back to the question of why Capital volumes 2 and 3 are not published. First reason, and it's a good reason, is ill. A nervous complaint that this is completely psychophysiological, needs no further explanation. It's only too obvious. The symptoms are known: eruptions, headaches, blah blah, and so on. So and then the other reason, in the case of Capital, another possible reason is that he's completely caught in politics. So he no longer has the time that he would need to spend hours, nights, working on the writing of the book. He writes enormously, but for immediate or for more direct political reasons. In this case, I'm sorry, I can't help. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. I read again and again the text, and I believe that he's trying very hard to say something that has to do, I agree with that, perhaps not with a different theory of history, but a different understanding of the what you called very rightly the articulation of theory and praxis. But the articulation of theory and praxis is not to be adapted to the circumstances and rectified with respect to a certain party orthodoxy, etc. If the status and the content of the theory is not modified, and so you are tempted, of course, to pick up some words which are really like symptoms, and because we know a lot more than Marx did at the time, particularly about the subsequent developments of Marxian politics in history, we are tempted. There's no guarantee. We take the risks. It's inevitable. We take the risk of pouring into that battle or introducing in the discussion notions or hypotheses that seem to be just, I would say, just below the surface of the words in Marx's. So you, of course, there's an element of imagination and perhaps even delirium in my attitude. I try, and it's not the same as, I don't have that pretension, as Tony Negri returning to the Grundrisse and saying, you see here there were possibilities that Marx cancelled and that we must retrieve. But still, so what is the word in the draft that works, in my opinion, as a symptom for a big, huge and fascinating philosophical problem? It's the word simultaneity or simultaneous. Marx writes, he says, you're asking me about the revolutionary potential, possibilities that are harbored, that are contained in the fact that Russia as a society, as a history, has not or not yet entirely witnessed or observed the full destruction of the commons, of a communal organization of property in the countryside. Of course, it's fragile because capitalism is there in Russia, and especially in the countryside. There are landowners. They are eager to destroy the commons. So to repeat, you're asking me about the relationship of this to the famous chapter in your capital about the primitive accumulation, the story of the enclosures and the violent destruction of communal structures in the countryside. Yes, it could be the same story, except it's taking place in a different moment. So in a sense, it's too late, and in another sense, it's too early. It's too early. So it's out of sync. It's out. This archaism is out of sync with the main tendency in developed, he uses the term, developed capitalist countries. And so if you, and it's very interesting when you move from the beginning, because he repeats himself, he writes the same sentences again. That's normal, of course, etc. So I shouldn't make too much of that. But between the beginning and the end of the draft. The draft he never sent. He could not send because he wasn't reaching a stable and satisfactory formula, among other reasons. So between the beginning and the end, the tendency becomes inverted. The beginning is, yes, has the following meaning. Yes, you are right, my friends, and the official Marxists are completely wrong. Russia is a specific history. And on the basis of its social traditions, the peasants' commune, something like a communist future can be imagined that will have followed a different path. So the meaning is, I'm full of hope for you. And when you arrive at the end of the draft, it's been almost completely reversed. Of course, you have this great institution on which you could imagine that you built a future, But I'm very worried, because it's already dissolving. Because so it's like a race between the development of capitalism and the possibility of a revolution. He says the commune will be saved, it will be redeemed only if a revolution take place. But that should be quick. That should take place quickly. Because other etc. So because the revolution will give the possibility, if I have time, I'll return to another aspect of that question, will give the possibility of putting together the communist element preserved, arising from this archaic past, with modern economic instruments, credit, technology, etc., etc. Sorry, we have seen 1.5 centuries after that, so we can put a name on that. Of course, it's a kolkhoz. He's announcing the possibility of the creation of a kolkhoz, a jump from archaic communal forms into modern or ultra-modern forms of collectivity. Now, this idea of the simultaneity, which means asynchronicity, is a great philosophical idea. And it's not, of course, because I was, I'll to say, a student, I can put another name on that. I can call it overdetermination, or precisely non-contemporaneity. But as we know, other Marxists have proposed similar ideas, even more perfect or better explained. That was Ernst Bloch's great idea, Ungleichzeitigkeit, non-contemporaneity, when he described the history of Germany and the causes of fascism. And to some extent, although it's not the same idea, there's also something that hints into that direction, which is Benjamin's idea, of course, that the revolution is a combination of a return of the suppressed past and the opening of a new future. So there's a family air, but at the same time, of course, and there are even bases, and you also think nothing is lost in a sense in Marx's writings and thinking, that before capital, so I know that you will scream and you'll say, stick to capital. That's the solid basis. I know I provoke you, as you have. But there are earlier texts where Marx, the young Marx, had asked very interesting speculative, but also political questions about non-contemporaneity or simultaneity of historical processes which are out of sync. That was the case in the 1844 manuscript called Introduction to the Critique of the Philosophy of the Hegelian Philosophy of Right, where he introduced this remarkable terminology, a combination of the prehistory and the post-history. So we are miles away here from of the linear evolutionist tendency or line of understanding. And so we understand, I believe, at the same time, that that there are virtualities in Marx's writing in the moment of crisis, in a sense, or in any case of difficulty, not crisis, but that the interpellation from the Russians produces for him. And at the same time, something like an epistemic, or I use my old terminology, I can't avoid that, an epistemic or epistemological obstacle. And the epistemological obstacle, of course, lies entirely in the fact that Marx is, well, it has two faces. First, he cannot to reject his own understanding of the dialectics of modes of production, the line of evolution of class societies, etc. That would destroy the basis of his theory. But on the and add to this that, of course, to destroy is a silly idea if you don't have something to put instead. Which is absolutely not his case. So probably he's sick. Is he sick because he stumbles on a difficulty, or does he stumble because he's sick, or etc.? I don't think, I never solved that. But I'm completely sure that you must make a symptomatic reading of these writing events, of these events in the material realm of writing. This is not to destroy your trust in the validity and the solidity of Marx's theory and the importance of his concept, but it's to make these questions, the articulation of abstract and concrete, or laws of history and singular, very singular histories in which we will call ourselves, or theory and politics, or theory and praxis, somewhat less unquestionable. Now, I know I was too. Allow me one more minute, if you on the question of the. I hope we can come back to the stakes of. I agree, they are very important. The state, the commune, the common. I think these texts are extremely rich. But as for the aporetic situation in which Marx, I believe, found himself at the time of the construction of the communist, catastrophic slip of the Freudian slip of the construction of the Socialist or Social Democratic Party in 1875. This is a crucial moment because for many reasons. It's if you ask the question, which texts in the Marxist tradition have been used as a kind of comprehensive foundation for the invention, the development, and the use of Marxism as a coherent and systematic theory. I believe I'm not simplifying too much if I say there are three of them. First, the Communist Manifesto, the idea that a revolution is not only possible but imminent, because history, the law of history, is the transformation of class struggle from one form to another. And I believe, or we believe, that we can demonstrate why the form in which we are living today in the present is final in some sense. A feeling that Marxists and others had again and again in history. Some have them today. Second possible basis, Capital Volume 1, as you rightly said, because for the reasons that I have already indicated, it's not totally different from the previous one, but it's more explicitly focused and concentrated on the issue of property. The historic tendency, as he writes it, for the institution of property to move from one figure to another until you reach something that is presented as a maximum. And the maximum of concentration of capitalist property is dialectically jumping or transformed into the abolition of property, the expropriation of expropriators. And then the third one was not written by Marx, but he collaborated to it. It's a very important fact to know. It's Engels's Anti-Düring, 1875, a critique of a man who is forgotten today, etc. So with the systematic distinction of scientific socialism and utopian socialism, and an additional twist. There's a chapter written by Marx in Engels's book. It's so he completely endorses the additional twist that he adds to the dialectic of modes of production as presented in Capital has to do precisely with a certain idea of communism, and that takes us to the vicinity of the correspondence with Vera Zasulich and also the Gotha Program in a sense. It's the idea that history begins with communal property, with common property, and that's work in common, use of the means of production, etc., in an archaic, precisely, or primitive form. It's totally 19th century evolutionism. They were reading. It's not philosophically. It's not completely different from Morgan, from Spencer, from. So it begins with the primitive form of commonality, and then it takes the whole trajectory of history. These extraordinary views from above, the whole trajectory of history to explain why these communal forms needed to become dissolved, that lead to extreme forms of individualism, individual property. It's very Hegel, of course, as well. And, of course, through a negation of the negation, the usual trick, or the etc., a restoration of the common, but this time, of course, not in primitive forms, but in highly progressive forms, and he mentions the acquisitions of science, the sophisticated division of labor, and so on and so on. So these are the three successive bases. And the last, of course, was the more influential in the history of the Socialist and Communist Party. But 1875 is also, not by complete change, of course, the moment when the two conflicts are reaching their most exacerbated forms, I would say. So the one that is reflected in the critique of the Gotha program. Lend me your volume if you please, because in the text that you have quoted, that you have given to us, we don't have this letter. I will retranslate. You'll find
the first letter? The
letter.
letter.
No, the last by Engels, but also the same date and etc. Doesn't matter. I'll retranslate from the French. I wish I had the German here, but it doesn't matter. So Engels sends the notes on the Gotha program to the destinataries. And he writes the following. Allow me to first read it in French. L'État populaire libre, the popular free state, which was the catchword of the Lassallians, est devenu un État libre. D'après le sens grammatical de ces termes, following the grammatical meaning of these words, un État libre, a free state, est un État qui est libre à l'égard de ses citoyens, is a state, but perhaps it's Staatswesen, I'm not sure, that is free with regard or in relationship to its own citizens. That is, c'est-à-dire un État à gouvernement despotique, hein, et a state with a despotic government, because the state is free and the citizens are not. Il conviendrait, he writes, d'abandonner tout ce bavardage sur l'État. It would be time. It's time to drop all this bullshit about the state. All this surtout après la Commune, above all, after the Paris Commune, qui n'était plus un État, which was no longer a state, au sens propre, in the proper sense. Les anarchistes, the anarchists, nous ont assez jeté à la tête, have had a good time throwing at our face l'État populaire, the popular state, bien que déjà le livre de Marx contre Proudhon, although already Marx's book against Proudhon rejected the idea, etc., etc. So the adversary on one side is statism, but statism here combines several ideas and intentions. It's a despotic government without control. It's not necessarily Trump, but it's what the despotic element inherent in the very essence of the state, and it is the intervention or the control through the use of the state of social processes, even the relying, it's explicit in the Gotha program critique, on state intervention or support to, for example, introduce, we are at the very, very early stages, protections. In Capital, Marx had alluded to that in his chapter on the length of the social rights, social protections, and also facilitating cooperatives, etc., etc. So it's a state that is despotic in its essence and that becomes social somehow in its uses and applications, because perhaps they want to avoid the critique of the anarchists. But why they want to avoid the critique of the anarchists, because the anarchists touch something extremely sensitive on the background of the Paris Commune. So what they fear is that the anarchists appear as better interpreters and readers and continuators of the Paris Commune than themselves, which is not something that they want to accept. So the text goes to incredible extremities and virulent formulations against every possible form of the of relying on the state power in order to construct socialism or communism. And on the other hand, the critique against Bakunin, I reread it very carefully. I believe I can show in which passages Marx's. So what you have in this small excerpt is only a part of the whole text, which is much longer, but it's the most explicit and the clearest part. So read that again, and you'll see that each time Marx writes something like nonsense, bullshit, stupid, can this guy be as dumb as that? For example, when Bakunin says, you speak of the necessity of using the state power in order to establish a regime that will make the transition possible between capitalism and socialism. So that's a government, writes Bakunin. So if it is a government, there are people who govern and others who are governed. Are these the same? Are these the same? Can you? Or he goes into details, Bakunin. He's good. I'm sorry to say that. He's good. He says, you'll explain to me that the governing body is made of workers. Sorry, excuse me, but these are no longer workers. These are former workers who have become administrators, party leaders, ministers, blah, blah, etc. So, of course, for us, it's easier because we've seen that actually in the real theory. But it's not a weak argument. It's not a weak argument. And Marx says, or the argument similar, more or less similar, in which Bakunin says, you explain that you're, of course it's irrationalist, you explain that the government of the proletariat is based on a scientific theory. So this will be a government of science. But science and the people, these are two different, etc. And Marx says, this is stupid, guy. You never, I can see that you have never worked with trade unionists and activists. You would see that they solve the difficulty in practice. And I don't say that that this is it's a partial replica. So in that, okay. So what I finish. What I wanted to say is that when I wrote the passages that you quoted, aporia, I was very fond of aporias. I loved aporias. I wanted to find aporias everywhere. I even more or less I was convinced that a thinker who is not aporetic on the crucial notion of his system or his thought, be it the absolute or the praxis or whatever you like, is not a thinker, of course. So I proposed that there was this aporia, and I explained, I tried to explain it in more or less sociological terms or historical terms by saying it has to do with language, that Marx writes in an ideological framework and environment where the language of political theory and practice is codified and organized around the use of these terms. Binary oppositions most of the time, the state and the society, the authority or authoritarianism on one side, and the spontaneity and self government, which can be also called anarchist in a positive sense. And I said he finds no absolutely new original terminology that would make it possible for him to jump beyond these antinomies. And that's where Bernard Harcourt, of course, enters the stage, and he says, but he has the idea. He doesn't have the words, but he has the idea, or he has the substance. And yes, at the time, I was more or less convinced, or better said, because of the infinite difficulties of Marxian politics at the time already, I was more or less convinced that the ultimate goal would be to overcome Marx's aporia or Marx's difficulty. That is to find the words, that contain or the dialectical words, if you like, that encapsulate or the new practice of politics. It was our catchword, the new idea and the new practice of politics that Marxism or revolutionary socialism had introduced in history. And therefore, I presented this aporia as something negative. And this is the point, I finish with that. This is the point on which I have changed position. Probably because at the time, and you'll perhaps not be happy with that, but I was more than ever of the idea that something called the revolution is there ahead of us. It was tried several times. It produced catastrophes. It failed, etc., etc. It became internally subverted by the counter-revolution, etc., etc. And now, of course, I still hope that a revolution is ahead. I think we need it for a number of reasons. But I am particularly, I'm more interested in the fact that the revolutions are behind us. And they're not behind us as failures. They are behind us as historical experiments. This is the beautiful name of the the book written by the Italian operaista Rita Di Leo on the Soviet Revolution, L'esperimento profano, the profane experiment, I find that. So the revolutions are profane experiments behind us. And if you look at the revolutions, for example, 1917, of course, I wrote that, etc. And you ask yourself, what kind of politics are they doing? What kind of politics is it that makes the revolution possible? That is the break with the previous social situation and the relationship of forces that becomes inverted. There's not much doubt about that. It's not the anarchist or spontaneist idea alone. The Soviets, the councils, the workers' councils, the self-organization of the proletarians alone. Clearly not. You need the party, the Leninist party, has formed and developed and by Lenin for I'm sorry reasons which are Machiavellian, even Schmittian. That is decision making in a critical situation with an organized capacity to erect a counter power confronting the state. So no Soviets, no spontaneity, no anarchist leaning, no commune, if you like, leaning politics, no revolution, no organized party, no strong leadership, no dictatorial mode of government, no revolution. So the revolution is a completely the revolution that makes the impossible possible. To borrow a philosophical formula from Badiou and others, which makes the impossible possible, that breaks the continuity of the existing society, is exactly this untenable or unstable combination of antithetic ideas and principles and of course in history, as we have seen it, it doesn't exist for long. It doesn't. It's one of the two principles has to prevail, and historically, it's more generally well. Could discuss that. So all this to say that what I saw as an aporia, I tend to see today as not as a solution, but as an invention. As an invention. The unity, perhaps it's my philosophical pet language. I think that revolutions are exactly that. They are antinomic combinations of antithetic principles of politics. And I'm not saying, and I don't believe that you will deduce any of these two from Marx's theory of capital. That's an addition. It has to be added. It is linked to the question raised again and again in these texts of how you jump from the abstract to the concrete. Sorry, I was probably
okay. No, that was marvelous. That was marvelous. So let me propose this. Let me make. I think I want to make three points. Maybe give you a 5 minutes to then we can open it up like the first 5 minutes, maybe not the shorter than the first 5 minutes, maybe. So first of all, I just want to emphasize that my intention with the provocations wasn't and isn't to kind of create a perfectly coherent, forceful Marx that we can then, march forward with, or follow, or, trot with. That's not, and the idea is to actually figure out the coherences in order to think about the political implications from those historical conjunctures to ours. So to help us kind of get towards the end of your talk, when you were talking about the possibilities of revolution, to actually push us to try and see how we could use this work, if there are sufficient coherences, to think through the present, right? So it's not by any means an effort to kind of create a solid Marx that we can just, get behind.
I
right?
imposed on
Okay.
on
No,
you,
that's okay. That's okay. So, and And the reason,
jacket.
pardon?
I imposed on you a kind of iron jacket of.
Yeah. So, and you know, that's not the goal, though, is to be able to say something or to think our present in a way, so that there's sufficient coherence and relationship for us to be thinking through the present. And the thing that I do find so remarkable is the second thing I should say is, of course, what's very interesting here is we are reading just a few sentences, right? There are very few sentences in fact. I refer to this as a political volume of capital or something like that, right? Which is it's ridiculous because what we have are single sentences. We have a single sentence in the letter to Zasulich. We have just a few sentence paragraphs in the Gotha program, right? We have a single sentence that ends with, from those according to their ability to those according to their needs, which is this. And from that, we are deriving so much, right? But there actually there's just a few sentences that we're working with. And so in that, and in that sense, when we read those sentences, I don't think we want to turn them into something that's stable, as you suggest, stable in the sense that there would be some kind of universal implication, right? It has to be the case, of course, that these sentences have to be read within their historical context because it's a historical comment, it's a political historical comment about a particular situation, whether it's 1875 or 1881 in Russia, right? So, so there isn't any stability here, except for the fact that if there are coherences, that the historical interventions, these short sentences, make sense at that time, in that context, and in fact kind of relate back to, say, the economic work of the capital. And I do find it stunning in this context that, when he talks about this scientific insight, now put aside the whole question of science and put aside the whole issues that were brought up with Althusser and epistemological breaks and whatnot, but just the way in which it's presented, that there are things now that we know, he wants to say here, that we know, which essentially are the things that he develops in Volume 1 of Capital, that mean that, we can look at the present politically in a different way and then write these sentences for these particular contexts. Now, I don't think we necessarily want to go back deep dive into the three texts, but I did want to say one thing about the Zasulich draft. And that is, and of course, it's always very difficult dealing with any unpublished work.
This one is not
interpretation.
It's unwritten.
Well, no, I mean the draft is the drafts are written, and there is in the here my hypothesis for why the final letter became so short.
Yes.
My hypothesis is he didn't really want to share the fact that he thought that the rural commune was going to get crushed. And he says it. Le concours d'influence destructive, à moins qu'il soit brisé par une puissante réaction, doit naturellement aboutir à la mort de la commune rurale. I mean, he's pretty clear here. He's pretty clear that je dévoile le mystère. I'm unveiling the secret that the actual state of the commune is not tenable.
Which means
which means
First, I agree with you. Second, you are wrong.
wait, well, let me finish what I was going to say, then you can say I'm wrong. He's actually thinking that this Russian commune thing is not tenable. He tells us it's not tenable. He tells us why, the way it's parceled out, it's not tenable. And, it's probably going to get crushed, unless there's some kind of Russian Revolution, immediate Russian Revolution, unless we can do something dramatic or something like that. And my hypothesis is he didn't want to tell Zasulich, look,
You can be right.
your commune is dead. Forget about it. And so he was kind of, and what does he say? He says, there are lots of problems. There are lots of problems with the commune. He says it in the final letter, right? Where is the final letter? Réponse, right? He says it, l'analyse de la commune, afin qu'elle puisse fonctionner comme telle, il faudrait d'abord éliminer les influences délétères, which is what he was talking about, les influences délétères qui l'assaillent de tous les côtés, et ensuite y assurer des conditions normales. So but obviously we're dealing with, it's impossible to know. Maybe it was nerves, maybe it was sickness. I don't think so. I think it was that it was a little too harsh what he was saying, which was very aligned with.
I don't disagree.
Okay.
I don't disagree.
Okay.
You put the weight on the tactical or strategic articulation with his interlocutors, and I put it more on the idea that taking the question as it was asked by Vera Zasulich to its roots or foundations, a problem of a philosophical problem of the it's not only the understanding, I'm tempted to say in quasi-Kantian Hegelian terms, the schematization of history, the figuration of the of history as a process was becoming problematic. But I don't think our positions are totally incompatible.
Yeah, no, yeah. And I heard some of that in what you were saying and in your texts too.
And then if I may, no, you were speaking.
Just
Go ahead.
but let me just say one last thing which can push you maybe in a different direction is that, of course, the effort now. So you can't get anything stable in terms of political praxis because everything depends on the historical circumstances. However, I think that you can possibly extract an approach that then could possibly help us think through our present. And that's what I want to ask you about, maybe to push us to our present so that we can address that.
I will give you an answer.
Okay. And the one that I'm proposing in a way is that what he's looking for at these different junctures, right, are the way in which to organize, to administer self-governance in order to achieve this revolution in the present conditions of production. And that the different interventions against Bakunin, against the Gotha program, et cetera, are trying to figure out, and then the question would be, how would we do that today in the present context, trying to figure out how those forms of organization can take place through a workers' party, through the executive committee of a trade union, through the managers of a working cooperative, of a workers' cooperative, to lead to the abolition of class distinctions and a radically new society. But I suppose that can give us something helpful today. I tend to push it in the direction of thinking through the stage of forms of cooperation, workers, cooperatives, et cetera, which are forms of organization for purposes of self-governance, right? So that in every aspect of our life, whether it's work or whether it's consumption, etc., we are organizing in such a way as to engage in self-governance, which could be helpful, but it could put it in other directions. But I think the point is, to avoid an aporia, so as to think through our present moment, right? So maybe we can kind of push the conversation towards, and of course there's a lot here having to do with populist movements, right? I mean, the Zasulich letter is all about possibly populist movements, and there are lots of populist movements going on today in various countries, right?
Populism
not
is what some
very
people
different.
would call a left populism.
Right. Okay, so go ahead. Sorry, Etienne.
No, okay, it's too long then. I want to give three answers, direct or indirect.
Okay.
But very quickly. First, a latent question regarding the forms of organization, that is the institutional and I'm tempted to say practical dimension of the revolutionary movement. That is clearly latent in all these texts. Excuse me. Is the question, is what has become called, labeled later by other Marxists after several experiences, the question of the party form. And in this respect, of course, there is an extreme position represented by Bakunin, and it's not a weak position. That's a point that I think we must keep in mind. But it's not. This is not to say that we ought to accept it. It doesn't object. Bakunin's position is, as soon as you create a party, the thing that you are trying to do in this moment in Germany and in other places, the implicit goal, we could return to the discussions, the First International after the Commune was torn between two great tendencies, Marx on one side, Bakunin on the other side. The discussion is huge, and so Bakunin and his followers that Marx attacks virulently, but the same is true in the other direction. If you read the complete notes taken by Marx, he learned Russian and read Statism and Anarchy. I thought I could bring the book here, not in Russian. I have it in German. It doesn't exist. I'm not sure if it exists in French. It's a 500 pages volume, And Marx copies entire passages, including the passage about him. Herr Marx, I will propose a portrait of Herr Marx, and the portrait is not deprived, to say the least, of anti-Semitism. He says, Herr Marx is a perfect example of the genius and the weaknesses and the dangers of his race, etc., etc. Bakunin's position is, as soon as you enter this road, you're doomed from a revolutionary standpoint, because the party, it's been repeated again and again throughout our history, because the party is a state in reversal. It's a mimetic image of the state. it functions exactly after with the same rules. And of course, this is because for him, the essence of the state is hierarchy, is theological political. It's absolute authority. So you'll create. I'm extremely so. The fascinating works have been written in the history of Marxism. Gramsci, of course, comes to mind immediately, but others as well. Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin himself, and so on, which tried to loosen the strangle knot. So that's to explain what makes a revolutionary party different from a state in reduction or in etc. So that's the first, but that's not easy. That's not easy, and so the second thing that I want to say is that, and Marx has no theory of the party. I mean, he has he advocates. He has objectives. He has principles. In the critique of the Gotha program, some of them are very important, and I find them extremely relevant. For example, the passage when he says the way you are building the Social Democratic Party in Germany is completely dependent on your idea that the party will need to use the state in order to achieve the transformations. So and this state will be the national state. So your party becomes a national party, if not a nationalist party. Where is the internationalism in there? It's been forgotten and suppressed. And we ought to be sensitive to that, because we know that we've seen various forms, more or less acceptable from a democratic point of view, but none that is very convincing as a revolutionary instrument, which impose, I would say, the nation form upon the party form, or at the expense of internationalism, and the consequences have been clear in matters of decolonization, in matters of migrations, etc., etc. So that's the first point. The second point is Marx shares it seems to me, the idea, especially in the text in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, and the text on the Commune, which repeats the 18th Brumaire from this point of view. He shares the idea of the scheme, the figure of the state as a machine, an apparatus, etc., that is located outside the actual working, if you like, of the social and economic functions. So that means that he's retreating behind the Hegelian understanding of the state. So maybe Hegel is wrong, but Hegel would never think that the state or its functions, its working, etc., must be observed and described as something external to the relations of forces, the economic processes, the social movements of the society. Of course, there are passages in Marx which, in a sense, contradict this schematic vision. And the most interesting, of course, are in Capital itself. For example, the lengthy chapter on the social rights imposed by the state to regulate and limit the violence of the extreme extremely brutal forms of exploitation deriving from the Industrial Revolution. So the limitation of the working day, the prohibition of the working of children and women, still not the case, of course, in today's capitalism. But and so there, the state is no longer something external. And even Marxist vocabulary reflects that. He says these laws, which are the result of a combined kind of a combined pressure from below and from above, a reformist politics of the state in the interest of the bourgeois class as such, and the class struggles, the pressure, the rebellions, and the strikes of the workers themselves, produce, for the first time, he says, a conscious regulation of social conflict on behalf of the society as a whole. But that's one passage, and then it's so. If we take a little bit of distance from there, we must say two things, I believe. As capitalism evolved, and today, not only neoliberalism does not contradict that, or Elon Musk's ridiculous project, etc., but it continues in the same direction. There's no capitalism. There's no capitalism as a process of exploitation and accumulation of value that does not require the permanent intervention and action of state regulations and powers. I am sure we agree on that. So the state is not external. It's not external, but it's internal. Now, some Marxists some time ago tried to propose a better formulation. Althusser and others introduced the problematic of the reproduction, which made it possible to have the state somehow organically involved in the continuation of the. But they never entirely overcome, as Marxists, the dualism that Marx had put in place. And that leads to my third idea, which I submit not as something inevitable or etc., but it is partly a result of the experiences that we that we had a few years ago at the time of the COVID and so on. I wrote a paper, which is not very good, but also not completely bad, I believe, in which I tried to take part in conversations and disputes about the function of the public services in our social crisis today. And so I proposed the following terminology. I said we need three different categories, not a binary opposition, but rather a triadic distinction. We need the idea of the state, perhaps the class state. I would not deny that. We need the idea of the public sphere, public services, public functions, etc. And we need the idea of the common. And of course, my idea was that the experiences we had to a greater or lesser degree during these years would show the relevance and the necessity of all three. But the central idea is, of course, the idea, and of course, the way in which what neoliberalism and post-neoliberalism, as we see these days, aims at destroying is not the state, it's the public. It's the public, so it's the idea, it's the public service, it's the and of course for the common it's pure and simply ignored and dismissed. But the way to resist this dramatic evolution, and possibly from within a resistance to that evolution, elaborate, I would say, revolutionary strategies and goals, is not simply, I disagree on this point, I don't want to make them too simple, etc., but with what our friends have written, and yourself to some extent, I mean, but others as well, on the idea of assembly or the idea of the common. I agree that it's very important. It adds something to what Marx writes about the commune, because Marx is obsessed with the question of property. So he repeats again and again that if you change the regime of property, the commune will prove able to govern the society. Clearly, and Bakunin is useful in a sense on that side. There's another there's another aspect of the problem, which is not just property or the concentration of property, but authority or governmentality, as Foucault might want to say. So that's the common we have in mind today, combines a reference to the old and periodically renewed issue of the commons as common property and common management of the resources, but it also adds the radical democratic element, I would say, of assembly or roots democracy, etc. So, but that's not the complete solution. We must abandon this dualistic choice that is so heavily weighing on Marx's discussions. Either the state, which is centralized, autocratic, technocratic, possibly, etc., or the common, which is democratic and cooperative. There's something else in the middle. And this and of course they are overlapping all the time, So that's my my tentative suggestion.
Okay, wonderful, marvelous. Good. So let's see. There must be people who want to jump in. I think we have a microphone in back that we can use. Let me see if I can get that. And then what?
Yes. Thank you very much, Robin. I'm a degree student of philosophy from the European Graduate School. I have a couple of questions where I would like to go back to the letter sent to Vera Zasulich
and the letter, yes.
And also
the letter.
Actually, also the drafts, because there's a detail in the drafts, and this goes to the philosophical side of the question, which seems interesting here as it touches this question of asynchronicity or
what?
Asynchronicity.
Oh, asynchronicity.
Asynchronicity or non-simultaneity of, let's say, progress, advancement, development. And that's when, of course, this is crossed out in the letter, but in the draft, nonetheless, Marx tries to develop an argumentation for why the commune, the rural commune, could be saved against the theory of the so-called local Marxists. Against the theory put forward by the so-called local Marxists,
yes.
Whom he doesn't seem to know. And he says that clearly, and he names many things such as the steam engine, capital, like some instruments of capital, the markets and so on, they were introduced in Russia overnight, as it were. So this he tries to bring up as a proof or an example in case that there doesn't have to be the same development and also the same temporality of development everywhere. And then he tries to bind it back to the commune, but the argument is never finished. So this seems really interesting to me,
Yes.
because it seems to suggest a sort of theory of asynchronicity when it comes to progress, certain leaps that can take place in different parts of the globe. I think it's also very relevant for today, since we want to actualize, because one might also ask, how then could something like a post-capitalist desire, to quote Mark Fisher, how could that emerge without the subjects in question having to go through the same development, through the same, let's say, learning steps, through the same Hegelian dialectics? So it seems to be a bifurcation even from the very dialectics. And maybe that's the reason why Marx is not developing it, fleshing it out in the end. But it seems something that's ever more relevant, because we cannot suppose, as you were also mentioning this, going from the communal to the hyper individualistic to get back to another state of the communal or communistic. If this were to be supposed for all regions and subjects of the world, we clearly do not have even the time and the resources for such a trajectory. So it seems a very important question. And if I might just ask as an addendum, going back to the very first seminar, where I asked a question regarding the third thesis on Feuerbach, this falling together of the transformation of the circumstances and the self, Selbstveränderung und Veränderung der Umstände, it seems to me again that there is a similar asynchronicity or non-simultaneity at work there, because in the first part of the third thesis, Marx clearly separates society in two parts. So what falls together is also at the same time separated in different parts, which seem to be at different stages altogether. Thank you.
Thank you. And just for clarification, were you saying this was the part that was struck out?
Yes.
Rayé? So it's about the naturalizing the capitalist production?
Exactly.
Section? Okay.
I can even give you the passage if you want.
Sure. Why don't you? Yeah.
For example, it comes up, I think, in the first and the second draft, and then it's dropped. And it's, for instance, the first draft, it says, if the admirers of the capitalist system in Russia deny that such a combination is possible, let them prove that Russia had to undergo an incubation period of mechanical production in order to make use of machinery. And there are other examples like banks, credit companies, etc., which were introduced, as it were, in the twinkle of an eye, I think he says in the second draft. So it's that passage I was referring to.
Shall I say?
Vas-y, ouais,
Yes.
bien sûr.
I think that I can be biased. I influenced by my own intellectual history. I think that this question of asynchronicity has been haunting Marxism continuously, but never located exactly at the same place. So in the drafts of the letter to Vera Zasulich, it seems to me, correct me if you have a different feeling, that Marx describes this situation more or less as he did for Germany in 1844, as a kind of exceptional and peripheral, I would say, situation. So the idea that the normal, regular form of development reigns or dominates the history of the so-called Western countries is never put into question. It's as if the the problem we have to face is a kind of well, it's a similar idea, of course, a non-homogeneity of the world system. And that's returned later in theorists of the world system. So from this, you may jump to the idea that to the next question, which is that's where the whole the considerations on the necessity to move from abstraction to concrete historical and sociological and political descriptions is especially relevant. What was my idea? I'm sorry. Yes, the next dimension of the problem is therefore whether you ought to try and universalize, or generalize or universalize the idea of asynchronicity, perhaps re-elaborate it, give it more precise content, connect it with economic laws or tendencies, so that the very idea of a perfectly simultaneous or contemporaneous situation becomes absurd. And I tried to say that Marx perhaps could not reach such a point of view, but that it's more or less haunting Marxism. Perhaps it's a question also of adopting the right frame of description and there's a latent national methodological nationalism that remains there in some of these discussions. Of course, Marx knows that the capitalist development is a world, is a process that concerns the world as such, and there are important developments which go in that direction at the two ends of Capital Volume 1. The quick but very striking development on the money of the world at the beginning. The market is a world market, or it's not a market, and the developments on the law of population at the end. But otherwise, especially when it comes to the intervention of the state, it's as if you could decide to observe capitalism in a national, within national boundaries. And that's the rationale behind the De te fabula narratur. In Germany, it will be like in England or in France, etc. But perhaps this is the wrong frame. And that's what later Marxists, with whom as everybody knows, I had acquaintances, theorists of the capitalist world system, very clearly explained. You cannot understand how capitalism develops if you adopt a narrow local or national frame, because the essence of capitalism is, or its laws of accumulation has to do with connecting processes which are not synchronic. Uneven development, whatever you want. But it's a very good question.
Yeah.
Look,
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
sorry for that, but I need a 2 minutes break.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
I don't know if we continue after that, but
Okay.
that's
All right. Okay.
I
Let's
think
take a 2-minute break, and we'll see how other questions. Line someone up. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Great. Anyone else? So, Étienne,
All right. All right, that's good.
I will have problems with my throat.
Bon, deux questions et puis on s'arrête, okay?
Okay.
C'est bon?
Ouais.
All right. So, one more question. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Also, you're from the University of Chicago.
Well, I'm from the Sorbonne University today with the University of Chicago.
Okay.
And my question essentially is, I mean, first of all, you both mentioned the notion of degrowth, also in connection with Kohei Saito and degrowth communism. And I mean, you mentioned towards the end, Mr. Balibar, the categories of the public sphere, just the class state, and the commons. And earlier you said that you were not fully convinced of, if I remember correctly, that you were not fully convinced of Saito's Degrowth Communism. So it was, I just kind of have, out of curiosity, I just wanted to know how, like, why you're not convinced. I mean, this is not a trick question or anything, just like out of curiosity.
Thank you.
I will
Thank
not
you.
embark on a long discourse on that. I fully sympathize with Saito's perspective, political perspective, his idea of combining ecology and socialism. And I also agree with the idea that this involves a revolution in the understanding of the interaction, let's put it like that, between man and nature. I'm also not against the idea of finding in Marx clear but marginal, like it or not, indications, sometimes in a very interesting, very acute form, indicating that Marx had become increasingly aware of the fact, undeniable today, that capitalist accumulation, call it growth if you want to call it like that, intrinsically contains or involves a destruction of the environment. There are several aspects, but the most interesting passage, of course, or sentence is towards the last part of Capital Volume 1, where Marx explicitly writes there is no capitalist development or capitalist process of accumulation that does not involve the destruction of the two, what he calls the two sources or factors of actual wealth. That's the term he uses. The human force on one side, and the earth or the land, the earth on the other side. But where I think Kohei is overstating his case, or this is when he, I mean, he returns to a very interesting notion that Marx had not invented, that he shared with contemporary geologists, science, naturalists, and so on, which in German is called das Stoffwechsel, so usually translated as the metabolism of man and nature. And so at the beginning of the chapter on work, on labor, excuse me, not work, that's an interesting nuance, and labor and valorization, Marx writes, the labor process is, first of all, implicitly, that means from an abstract point of view, a process of metabolism where the human agency transforms nature or acts upon natural conditions as a natural force itself. So that seems to introduce a kind of reciprocity. And Saito wants us to carry the idea of this reciprocity to its extreme and logical conclusion, that is reverse or abolish, if you like, the subject-object scheme. The idea that labor, the problem is with different concepts of labor. So one of them, the one that Marx not only never abandoned, but put at the basis of his theory of value, of valorization, was humans, societies, in forms that are need to be described as precisely as possible, are acting as forces of transformation, natural, if you like, of course, from a materialist point of view, upon a given object, which is nature. But it's not the case that the relationship becomes a reciprocity. Or if it's the case, which is a very interesting idea, of course, and probably a materialist, then you have to drop the theory of value as a foundation for your economic theory. Because the theory of value is not based on the idea that natural forces, machines, instruments, etc., produce value. It's entirely based on the idea that it's human labor that produces value. So Marx's representation of labor is completely dissymmetric, and it's of course anthropocentric. And Saito, in a very exciting and interesting way, proposes a bifurcation from there to adopt a concept of labor, which is more, of course, acceptable from an ecological point of view, which becomes symmetric, in which nature acts upon humans, just as humans act upon nature. So that's a theoretical dilemma, if you like, where you have to choose. And I suggest, perhaps I'm too simple, too simplistic, that you can't have it both ways. With Marx on the theory of value, and with Saito and others on a non-anthropocentric concept of labor. I'd very much like to discuss that with him.
Yeah, let me just jump in on this as well. I think that there's we had a terrific discussion about this with Kohei. I think that there's no question but that transforming the conditions of production will be a strategy that goes with degrowth.
Speak louder.
Sorry, that transforming the conditions of production will necessarily entail degrowth or less growth.
But I agree with that entirely.
Right. No, but so now, and no, I'm not, this wasn't a provocation or a contradiction. It's just now,
and that's why we are in a political mess, because the forces in this society which agree with the prospect of a degrowth economy are completely marginal, and they're neither on the side of the capitalists nor on the side of the workers and the people.
Right. And I would also say that while I really admire Kohei's work, I wouldn't want, I mean, the step that I am not comfortable with is to say, basically, this was where Marx was going. And I actually don't feel that that's necessary in any way. And it actually, that rubs me a little bit. There's where I feel that I'm not sure. I mean, rereading the Gotha program again, right? The idea that he was actually turning back on the kind of productivism is like, no, look what he says about child labor, right? What does he say about child labor? The general prohibition of child labor is incompatible with the existence of large-scale industry. It's thus only an empty, pious wish, right? Its implementation, if possible, would be a reactionary step. I mean, this is not kind of revisiting questions of productivism, right? It's like we're gonna use kids, right? Kids and education is the most powerful means for the transformation of present society, right? So
you're absolutely right.
So there are ways in which, but I think that nevertheless, I was really convinced and admire and am really want to pursue the conversation about degrowth communism that Kohei raises and brings up. But I just don't think it's necessary to be shoehorning it into Marx's work necessarily. And there, even though there are places where, I mean, another spot that that's very important for Kohei is in the famous paragraph about according to abilities, according to needs, and there's so many subclauses in that little paragraph, right? That's, of course, that's one of the sentences I'm talking about. It's like we all just reread that one sentence and extract so much from it. He's focusing on the one on the subclause where he says all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, suggesting that that was actually not that we've moved towards some form of that the word cooperative there actually suggests that we've moved away from some forms of productivism. But there's the other one there, which is labor when the all-round development of individuals increase their productive powers, right? So I don't think I'm just
go ahead.
Yeah, I think that degrowth seems inevitable in any kind of concept one would have about transforming modes of production. But I don't think we necessarily need to find it specifically in Marx's text. Yeah. Okay, I think we've got time for one last question for the year, and it's two. Do we got two? Two. We got time for two more last questions. One of them is from Matteo Polleri, who I just should say we had an extraordinary conversation. It's on the Marx 1313 website. It was a keynote interview with Matteo on the relationship between Marx and Foucault. And so it was a great conversation. It's recorded. It's on there. And of course, that was it. That is his research, his thesis. He wrote a brilliant thesis on this. Okay.
Thank you, Bernard. Do you hear me? Yeah. I would like to know more, Etienne, on a sentence you mentioned quickly during your talk, which was the revolution is behind us. I feel there are at least three different senses of this sentence, but I let you add something on this topic. The first is that revolution is over as a political logic of change, which is the most immediate sense I can hear, I can get. The second is that revolution could be today something closer to a bifurcation. A lot of scholars and comrades are using the concept of bifurcation today.
Of what?
Bifurcation.
Bifurcation.
Yes.
And the third sense, which was basically the very core of our conversation today, was the fact that revolution is behind us because once we get to a revolutionary moment, to develop it, we need to find a basis which is in a way historically behind the history, the linear history of capitalism. The Russian commune or the agricultural commune of the indigenous people in Peru, as Jose Carlos Mariátegui suggested, way after the letter to Vera Zasulich, and developing this idea in another political and social geography. So there are these three senses of your idea that revolution is behind us. But the first is that, at least that it's what I got listening to you today, is that the very logic of revolutions is something that we can see as something that was situated in the past. Mm-hmm. So if you can add something on this point, it would be great. Thank you.
Before you do, Etienne, I just want to say that the one line that I wrote down of Etienne during this talk was, quote, "I still hope the revolution is ahead." So there was also that in your talk.
So perhaps the formula, my English failed me at that point. The revolution is behind us is ambiguous. What I wanted to say is that we have behind us experiences, experiments, if you like, Rita Di Leo's Esperimento Profano, of revolution. So the revolution is no longer a kind of utopian future, a mere object of hope or desire. Now, in a sense, so the concept of revolution needs diversification and analytic discussion. Now, you might say that, in fact, if we take Marx's and writings and his followers or disciples, this was always the case because they had a model. They elaborated a model of revolution. I argued that in somewhere. So but the model is complex. It's double. What seems to be the most immediate formula is that every concept of the coming revolution, the coming communist revolution in Marx and after him, remained very strongly attached, dependent on the model of the bourgeois revolution, or even better, the typical bourgeois revolution, the great bourgeois revolution that is the French Revolution. As a German romanticist, I think it was Schlegel or another one, wrote, and that I quoted that, it's well known. The French Revolution was die Revolution schlechthin, the revolution absolutely speaking. And the consequence is that certain fundamental schemes are borrowed from there and continuously repeated. It's not so it's not only Trotsky that famously explains that when Stalin comes to power, yes, we know that it's Thermidor, or it's Napoleon seizing the whole process, but it's much more general than that. And in particular, I argued that somewhere, it governs with all its nuances and varieties the way Marxists imagine the antagonism between revolution and counter-revolution that comes from the end. But in fact, the Marxist model was more complex than that because it combined the model of the French, the Great Revolution, and the idea of the Industrial Revolution, which is a social transformation. Engels, in his 1844 or 45 extraordinary book, The Situation of the Working Class in England, is one of the first He's not the first, but he's one of the first that I know. One of the first systematic users of the idea of the Industrial Revolution. And there are some great Marxist historians who built their work on that, not small. So the concept is more complex. It's the idea of what there is that is common or that articulates the political revolution, whose archetype is the French Revolution, and the social or better, or therefore also industrial, technological, social revolution, whose model is the English or the British industrial revolution. So the revolution but these, of course, by definition, were not communist revolutions. And we are in a situation in which we can reflect on experiences or experiments, I would say, of communist revolutions. So that's something impossible to neglect. But it doesn't amount. It may have consequences on the forms and ways in which we will try and imagine future revolutionary processes or changes or events, especially if following the very strong and clear indications that Marx gives in his controversy with Bakunin, etc. We put, and also in a different manner in the letter to Zasulich, we somehow we are not just the famous definition proposed by Lenin that was repeated interminably was a revolution needs conditions, and these conditions are of two different natures, objective and subjective, etc. Blah blah. Or the ruling class, the revolution takes place when the ruling class is no longer able to govern, and the subaltern class or the exploited class no longer accepts to be governed, etc. So, but that still leaves a kind of exteriority, distance between the revolution itself and the conditions of the revolution. Perhaps a better or greater degree of historicity or historicization will try and include the understanding of the conditions in the description or concept of the revolution itself, which would lead to something like a very general or speculative idea. There are never, and there never will be, two revolutions of the same model. I mean, it's the same, etc. So, and then you may ask, so why do you call them communist or blah blah? They reinvent communism. I'm tempted to say. I mean, if they, that's the, but okay, that's all I. That's all I could say.
Great. And the only thing I would add is we've had very fruitful other conversations along the other dimension of the difference between the classical concept of revolution and uprisings and other forms of uprisings, particularly in the context we had one with Étienne in an earlier 1313, the first one for uprisings, where we also were looking at the different dimension of the modern revolution versus other forms. Okay, we've got time.
I'm sorry, do we have a last question?
We got one last question.
Okay, one last question.
No, go ahead.
My throat.
All right, we got time for one last question. Professor Anton Ford from the University of Chicago.
In the spirit of bringing this to questions of how to think about the present, I wanted to ask whether either of you thinks that the advent of artificial intelligence raises any new questions for Marxism. Is it just more of, I mean, obviously the idea that capitalism revolutionizes forces of production in a way that, puts in the shade all previous modes of production, is an old idea, an early idea, the idea that the Industrial Revolution is a massive change. The discussion of machinery in Capital One. It's not like this is a new. The idea of automation has always been brought up, and throwing people out of work, and these issues have always been part of Marxist theorizing. But
Right.
one wonders, like, are we seeing something that is, at least the question, I think the question can arise now, are we in the middle of seeing an explosion of productivity that puts all previous explosions of the history of capitalism in the shade? And if so, does that raise any new questions, or is it just more of the same? Is it just, refer to the chapter on machinery?
Let's start again. What I'm first tempted to say is I remain stunned and amazed when I see how much of Marx's descriptions of these phenomena, the machinery, the progressive, the becoming automatic of production processes, the articulation of that technological upheaval or revolution with the introduction of new forms of surplus value and therefore accumulation. So how much of that remains relevant? I mean, of course, first of all, it's, I remember discussions about that a long time ago when we read Negri on one side, but also Braverman trying to work on Taylorism as a form of capitalist management and so on. So I remember, it's not, I don't say that for narcissistic reasons. I remember a colleague who was a real expert on the history of mechanization in industry and other social processes, who had read my very abstract chapter in the collective book Reading Capital, where I had a development on Marx's concept of technology. And he said, I'm surprised to see how much of what you say, following Marx, of course, is confirmed or matches the later processes, particularly the Taylorist division of labor and so on. And I said, yes, it's amazing. It's because Marx had not only he had an insight, but he had a concept that allowed him, that plays into your game, I hope. I mean, that allowed him to identify the intrinsic articulation of technological change and capitalist exploitation. So then I lost my then we're back to from another side to the question that was raised about Kohei Saito. It's about the place and function of labor. That is the sensitive issue. Marx is very, and Tony Negri made a fantastic development on that basis, because Marx in Capital and even more in the Grundrisse writes that the profit that capital is accumulating no longer directly comes from the expense of the labor force, but comes from the machinery and the scientific and therefore capitalism already includes a kind of non-capitalist element. That's where I would disagree. I don't believe it's non-capitalist. On the contrary, but it's completely capitalist. So that's why even if I admire the rhetoric of Yanis Varoufakis and his model Cédric Durand, I don't believe that this takes us back to feudalism. It's completely capitalist. But it's a capitalism whose source of accumulation does clearly not rely pure and simply on the expenditure, excuse me, of the quantitative expenditure of the labor force. Now you might want to say, and this is very much what Tony tried, and therefore I admire his boldness, to adopt a more general concept of labor, which practically becomes limitless. Every activity in society from which capital today is able to derive value and surplus value is a form of labor. So it's in a sense the exact opposite of Kohei Saito, because it's ultra subjective. And it's very intelligent, but I'm not sure that it is analytically very, very helpful to describe well, that's a matter of long discussions.
All right. Well, I think that brings us to a close
I cannot go further.
No. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
trying so hard. Thank you, Etienne. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Anthony Foussard in back for the AV, and Ricardo Lombera back in New York for organizing everything. Thanks for coming out. I think this brings a close to Marx 1313.
For continuing this beautiful project.
Yes.
Year after
And
year.
yes.
If
And
that
yes.
is the possibility.
The project will be back next year with another 1313.
Which I won't open and won't conclude.
We'll see. All right. Okay. Thanks, everyone.